Imagine this for a moment. A German commander speaks with confidence, believing winter, distance, and fear have already won the battle. Snow is falling, roads are frozen, Allied troops are trapped. History says nothing should move, nothing should happen. But one man hears those words, and instead of replying, he does something so bold, so unexpected, that it shocks both friend and enemy. An entire army turns. The impossible begins to move. What happened next didn't just change a battle, it rewrote how wars are won. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step, don't skip it. History is often remembered for its gunfire and explosions, but the true turning points of war sometimes begin with words. It was the winter of 1944. Europe was bleeding under snow and steel. The German army, wounded but dangerous, had launched one last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge, and standing against that gamble was a man who did not believe in pauses, excuses, or fear. General George S. Patton. Somewhere across the frozen front, a German commander delivered a message, cold, calculated, confident. It was not just a tactical statement, it was a psychological one. A reminder that the enemy still believed he could dictate the tempo of the war. Patton heard the words, and then he acted. Patton's first response was not anger. It was clarity. Patton did not shout. He did not waste time with insults. Instead, he did what made him terrifying to his enemies. He decided. While others debated supply lines and weather forecasts, Patton looked at the map and saw only one truth. Speed would decide the fate of thousands. At that very moment, American troops were trapped, cold, and surrounded. German commanders believed winter itself was on their side. They believed no army could move fast enough to break through snow, ice, and chaos. They did not understand Patton, the order that changed everything. Patton turned to his staff and gave one of the most audacious orders in military history. Turn the entire Third Army 90 degrees. We're attacking now, not tomorrow, not when the weather cleared, not when conditions were acceptable. Now, it was considered impossible. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, frozen roads, limited fuel. But Patton believed something deeper than logistics. An army that moves with purpose moves faster than fear. While the enemy spoke, Patton moved. The German commander had relied on tradition, on expectation, on the assumption that winter slowed all men equally. Patton shattered that belief. Columns of American armor began rolling through snowstorms so thick drivers could barely see the hood of their vehicles. Engines froze, men marched with bleeding feet. Sleep became a luxury, and yet they moved because Patton had given them more than orders. He had given them conviction. The psychological counterattack. Patton understood something many commanders never grasped. War is fought twice, once on the battlefield and once in the mind, by moving faster than anyone thought possible. Patton sent a message louder than any reply. You do not control this war anymore. German commanders who had spoken with confidence suddenly found American tanks where no tanks were supposed to be. Supply lines were cut. Defensive plans collapsed under the weight of surprise. Words had failed. Action had answered. Relief, redemption, and reality. When Patton's forces broke through and relieved the trapped American troops, it was not celebrated with speeches on the front lines. Men were too exhausted, too cold, too aware of how close they had come to annihilation. But they understood one thing clearly. Someone had refused to let them be forgotten. Patton later said that wars are not won by defense, but by relentless offense. Yet in that moment, what he truly demonstrated was something more human. Leadership is the refusal to accept inevitability. What Patton really did after the enemy spoke, he did not respond with words. He responded with movement, with speed, with faith in his men. He turned a German commander's confidence into a fatal miscalculation, and in doing so, he reminded history of a brutal truth. When resolve meets hesitation, hesitation dies first. Closing reflection, The snow eventually melted. The war eventually ended. Patton did not live to see the full peace he helped create. But his response to that moment, after the enemy spoke, still echoes through military history, because sometimes the most powerful answer to an enemy's words is action that arrives before they are ready to hear it. In war, words often arrive first. They cross borders faster than armies, slip through radio static, travel on paper, and settle into the minds of commanders long before a single shot is fired. Words are used to threaten, to reassure, to deceive, and sometimes to stall. A German commander's statement in the winter of 1944 was not merely information. It was an assertion of control, a belief that by speaking first, by defining the moment, the enemy could shape reality. Such words carried the weight of tradition, of centuries of European warfare where pauses were negotiated, seasons were respected, and fronts were expected to remain stable when nature turned hostile. Those words assumed that logic, weather, and caution would restrain all men equally. George S. Patton understood words very well. He used them relentlessly on his own troops, sharp, profane, theatrical language designed to harden resolve and strip fear of its power. But when words came from the enemy, Patton treated them differently. To him, enemy words were not dialogue, they were signals. They revealed assumptions. They exposed expectations. They betrayed what the other side believed could or could not be done. Where others heard provocation or insult, Patton eared opportunity. He listened not for meaning but for limitation. The German commander spoke with confidence because confidence was required. The situation demanded it. Winter had closed the roads, snow had swallowed supply lines, and ice had turned movement into risk. The German words rested on a simple premise that the environment itself would enforce a pause, that armies would wait because armies always had, that men would need permission from weather, from logistics, from tradition to move. The words assumed patience on the other side. They assumed deliberation. They assumed hesitation. Patton did not argue with the words. He did not counter them with speeches or messages of his own. He knew that words, once exchanged, could become a trap. To respond in kind would mean accepting the enemy's chosen battlefield, a battlefield of language, delay, and negotiation. Patton refused that ground. He believed that the moment a commander begins explaining instead of acting, momentum begins to die. In his mind, every hour spent discussing was an hour granted to the enemy to reinforce, to reorganize, to breathe. Action for Patton was not simply movement. It was disruption. It was the deliberate violation of expectation. By acting where words predicted stillness, he could unbalance an opponent more effectively than any rebuttal. German planning had accounted for American strength, American numbers, American firepower. It had not fully accounted for American immediacy. Words had drawn a mental map of what the next days would look like. Patton intended to tear that map apart. There was also a deeper understanding at work. Patton knew that soldiers at the front heard words too. Rumors traveled quickly, messages filtered down, distorted but potent. If enemy words suggested inevitability, delay, or encirclement, those ideas could take root in tired minds. Patton believed that action was the only antidote to despair. A moving army feels alive. A waiting army feels hunted. By acting decisively, he was not only countering the enemy commander, he was speaking directly to his own men without saying a single word. The contrast between words and action became visible almost immediately. German intelligence, accustomed to predictable responses, struggled to interpret what was happening. Reports contradicted expectations. Units appeared where no units were supposed to be. Timetables collapsed. Orders based on assumptions no longer matched reality. The enemy's words, once intended to shape the battlefield, now echoed hollowly against the noise of engines and artillery. What had been said no longer mattered. What was happening mattered more. Patton's faith in action was not reckless bravado, though it often appeared that way. It was grounded in an almost brutal realism about human behavior. He believed that fear grows in stillness, that doubt multiplies in silence, that confidence is forged not by reassurance but by motion. Every mile advanced was a statement. Every bridge crossed was a reply. Every unexpected appearance was a sentence written in steel instead of ink. There was also a moral dimension to this choice. Patton understood that words could distance a commander from consequence. Orders spoken abstractly could hide the cost in blood and exhaustion. Action forced immediacy. It demanded ownership. By choosing to act, Patton accepted responsibility not just for success, but for failure. Words can be revised, denied, reinterpreted. Action cannot. Once an army moves, the outcome belongs to the man who moved it. The enemy commander's words were rooted in the belief that war followed rules. Patton believed war punished those who waited for rules to protect them. He had studied history obsessively, not as a collection of quotes, but as a record of decisions made under pressure. He saw again and again that decisive moments rarely announced themselves politely. They arrived disguised as inconvenience, risk, or impossibility. The commander who waited for certainty usually arrived too late. As Patton's forces advanced, the meaning of the original words dissolved. What had been intended as a statement of control became evidence of misjudgment. The enemy had spoken from a position that no longer existed. The battlefield had changed beneath those words, rendering them irrelevant. In war, relevance is everything. An idea that no longer matches reality becomes dangerous to the one who believes it. For Patton, this was the ultimate victor. Why over words? Not silencing them, but making them obsolete. He demonstrated that the fastest way to defeat an enemy's narrative is to create a new reality before that narrative can adapt. Action accelerates time. It compresses decision-making on the other side, forcing mistakes, panic, and improvisation. Words require space to work. Action removes that space. This philosophy carried risk, and Patton knew it. Vehicles broke down, men collapsed from exhaustion, supply lines stretched thin. Action always extracts a price, but Patton believed the price of inaction was higher, even if it was less visible. A delayed response would have validated the enemy's words, turning them into prophecy. By acting, he denied the enemy that power. In the quiet moments between movements, Patton reportedly reflected not on what had been said, but on what had been done. He measured success not by how effectively he had answered the enemy, but by how thoroughly he had disrupted their expectations. Words fade quickly in war. Reports replace them. New orders overwrite old statements. But the shock of unexpected action lingers, shaping decisions long after the moment has passed. The clash between words and action in that winter campaign revealed something timeless about conflict. Those who rely on words believe the future can be negotiated. Those who rely on action believe the future must be seized. Patton belonged firmly to the second camp, not because he despised words, but because he understood to air limits. He knew that at a certain point, language becomes noise, and only movement cuts through it. Only momentum reshapes the situation. Only action forces history to change direction. Speed in war is not measured only by miles per hour or by how quickly tanks cross a road. It is measured by how fast a commander can think, decide, and act before the enemy understands what is happening. George S. Patton believed that speed was not simply an advantage, but a weapon in itself, as lethal as artillery and more destabilizing than air power. To him, speed shattered certainty. It denied the enemy time, and time in war was the most precious resource of all. During the winter campaign of 1944, Speed became Patton's answer to every obstacle placed before him. Snow, ice, exhausted men, frozen engines, and strained supply lines were not reasons to slow down in his mind. They were reasons to accelerate. He understood that the German command structure was built on calculations. How long it took units to move, how long it took reinforcements to arrive, how long weather would delay operations. These calculations created a fragile sense of order. Speed destroyed that order. Patton knew that a fast-moving force forces the enemy into constant reaction. Reaction is always slower than initiative. An army reacting must first understand what is happening, then decide what to do, then communicate that decision, and finally act. A fast-moving army compresses that entire cycle, attacking before enemy can complete even the first step. In this way, speed multiplies strength. A smaller force moving rapidly can appear larger, more dangerous, and more unpredictable than a larger force moving cautiously. For the soldiers under Patton's command, speed was both exhausting and empowering. Marching through freezing nights, driving vehicles with numb hands, and sleeping in brief intervals pushed men to their limits. But speed also gave them purpose. They were not waiting to be surrounded or shelled. They were advancing, taking the initiative, choosing the direction of danger rather than absorbing it. Movement gave them a sense of control in a war that often stripped soldiers of it. Patton believed that hesitation was contagious. One delayed order could ripple outward, slowing an entire army. Speed, on the other hand, created its own momentum. Once units were moving, stopping them became psychologically harder than continuing forward. He exploited this human tendency relentlessly. Orders were issued with urgency. Expectations were set high, and delays were treated not as logistical problems, but as failures of will. This approach was harsh, but Patton believed war rewarded harshness more than comfort. The enemy felt the effects of this speed even more sharply. German commanders were trained in methodical planning and precise execution. Their strength lay in coordination and disciplined response. But speed disrupted coordination. Units arriving too early or too late created gaps. Orders based on outdated information led forces into positions that no longer made sense. Speed turned German discipline into rigidity, making it harder for them to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Speed also altered the psychological landscape of the battlefield. When an enemy appears sooner than expected, fear intensifies. Defensive positions feel incomplete. Plans feel unfinished. Confidence erodes. Patton understood that fear was not just a byproduct of combat, but a tool that could be shaped. By moving faster than expected, he forced German soldiers and commanders alike to confront uncertainty. They were never sure where the next attack would come from or how much time they had to prepare. Logistics officers worried constantly about whether speed could be sustained. Fuel consumption increased. Maintenance schedules were compressed or ignored. Supply convoys struggled to keep up. Patton accepted these risks because he believed that speed created opportunities that logistics alone could not. Captured enemy fuel, seized supply depots, and shortened battles often compensated for the strain. He believed that bold movement could solve problems that cautious planning would only prolong. Speed also demanded trust. Patton had to trust his subordinate commanders to make decisions without waiting for permission. Orders were often broad in intent but narrow in time. This empowered aggressive officers and exposed timid ones. In Patton's army, hesitation was visible. Thus, who could not keep pace were quickly replaced or sidelined. Speed acted as a filter, elevating leaders who thrived under pressure and pushing aside those who needed certainty before acting. There was a moral complexity to this philosophy. Speed saved lives by ending battles sooner, but it also consumed lives through exhaustion and risk. Patton rarely softened this reality. He believed that a longer war cost more blood than a faster one, even if speed made individual moments more dangerous. To him, prolonged caution was a hidden killer, stretching suffering across months instead of compressing it into days. Weather, which many commanders treated as an absolute limitation, was another enemy Patton sought to outrun. Snowstorms delayed aircraft and froze roads, but they also blinded reconnaissance and disrupted communication. Patton saw these conditions not only as obstacles, but as cover. Speed under bad weather achieved surprise precisely because it seemed unreasonable. The enemy assumed movement would stop. Patton moved anyway. Speed also shaped how Patton viewed time itself. He treated hours as units of combat power. Every hour gained was an advantage. Every hour lost was a gift to the enemy. This mindset created relentless pressure on his staff and troops. Planning cycles were shortened. Decisions were made with incomplete information. Patton accepted uncertainty as the price of speed, believing that clarity often arrived only after action had already begun. As Patton's forces surged forward, the battlefield became fluid. Lines on maps blurred. Traditional fronts dissolved. Speed turned warfare into motion rather than position. German commanders found themselves fighting not a stable enemy line, but a series of sudden appearances, withdrawals, and thrusts. This fluidity favored Patton's style, which thrived on chaos and punished predictability. The weaponization of speed was not about recklessness, it was about dominance of tempo. Patton sought to control not just where battles happened, but when. By deciding the timing, he forced the enemy to fight on unfavorable terms. Fatigue, confusion, and lack of preparation became as damaging as any physical loss. Speed ensured that the enemy was always slightly behind events, always reacting to a past reality rather than the present one. For Patton, speed was the purest expression of offensive warfare. It transformed intention into reality before doubt could interfere. It reduced the enemy's choices and expanded his own. It turned momentum into pressure and pressure into collapse. In a war defined by machinery and mass, speed restored the primacy of decision and will, proving that how fast an army moved could matter more than how many guns it carried or how strong its defenses. Warped psychological warfare begins long before bullets fly and continues long after the guns fall silent. It lives in expectations, fears, rumors, and assumptions. George S. Patton understood that the human mind was a battle-fly, LD, as real and consequential as any stretch of land. He believed that once a soldier's confidence was shaken, the physical fight was already half lost. In this sense, psychological warfare was not an accessory to combat for Patton. It was the foundation upon which victory was built. Patton cultivated an image deliberately. His polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols, and dramatic speeches were not vanity alone. They were weapons. He wanted his own soldiers to believe they were led by someone larger than life, someone who embodied certainty in a world of chaos. At the same time, he wanted the enemy to see him as relentless, unpredictable, and impossible to deter. Reputation, in Patton's view, was a form of preemptive attack. During the winter campaign of 1944, psychological pressure became decisive. German commanders believed they had chosen the moment well. The weather was brutal, Allied supply lines were stretched, and morale was fragile after months of fighting. The German plan relied not only on tactical surprise, but on mental shock. They expected hesitation, confusion, and delay from the Allied response. Patton turned that expectation against them. By moving rapidly and aggressively, Patton created cognitive dissonance. What German commanders thought should be happening was not happening. This gap between expectation and reality is deeply unsettling. It forces doubt. Doubt leads to hesitation, and hesitation in war can be fatal. Every unexpected movement, every premature encounter with American forces chipped away at the enemy's confidence in their own understanding of the situation. Patton also understood the power of rumor. Soldiers talk. News travels faster than official orders. He allowed his reputation to spread unchecked. Stories of his speed, his temper, and his aggressiveness circulated through prisoner interrogations and intercepted communications. Whether exaggerated or true, these stories served a purpose. They magnified fear. They suggested that resistance was futile because the man coming toward them did not respect limits. For his own troops, psychological warfare worked in the opposite direction. Patton's certainty was infectious. Even when plans were risky, his confidence made them feel inevitable. Soldiers could endure extreme hardship if they believed it had meaning and direction. Patton gave them that belief. He spoke as if victory was not just possible, but already underway. This framing reduced fear and replaced it with resolve. He was also ruthless in how he addressed fear. Patton believed that acknowledging fear too openly could legitimize it. His speeches often mocked hesitation and glorified aggression. This approach was controversial and harsh, but it shaped behavior. Soldiers learned that forward movement was expected, normal, and praised, while doubt was something to be overcome, not indulged. In this way, Patton engineered a psychological environment where aggression felt safer than passivity. On the enemy's ID, psychological warfare manifested in the collapse of planning. German officers relied on timetables and assumptions to maintain control over their forces. Patton's unpredictability made those tools unreliable. When plans failed repeatedly, trust in leadership eroded. Commanders began to question intelligence reports, orders from higher headquarters, and even their own judgment. Psychological warfare thrives in such uncertainty. Patton also exploited symbols. When his forces appeared in places they were not expected, the shock was symbolic as well as tactical. It signaled that no position was truly secure. Defensive lines lost their psychological value. A line is only reassuring if it feels permanent. Patton made permanence impossible. Every breakthrough suggested another was coming, even when resources were limited. The weather, often seen as neutral or even protective, became another psychological tool. By advancing in conditions considered prohibitive, Patton reinforced the idea that nothing could stop him. This perception mattered as much as actual strength. Soldiers who believe they are facing an unstoppable force are more likely to retreat, surrender, or make mistakes. Patton understood that the enemy's belief in his momentum could achieve results that firepower alone could not. Psychological warfare also extended to deception. Patton was famously associated with decoy operations earlier in the war, where his presence suggested attacks that never came. This history amplified his psychological impact in later campaigns. Even when he was not attacking, the possibility that he might be forced the enemy to remain on edge. Constant alertness is mentally exhausting. An exhausted mind is slower, less flexible, and more prone to error. For Patton, psychological warfare was inseparable from tempo. Fast operations did not allow the enemy time to recover mentally. Each shock followed the last before equilibrium could be restored. This cumulative effect was devastating. Individual setbacks might be absorbed, but a continuous stream of surprises overwhelmed the enemy's capacity to adapt. There was also an ethical complexity to Patton's approach. Manipulating fear, pride, and expectation came at a cost. His own soldiers bore the weight of constant pressure and high standards. Not everyone thrived under it. Some broke down, some resented him. Patton accepted this as the price of psychological dominance. He believed that war itself was an ethical rupture, and that victory achieved quickly was the least cruel outcome. Patton's understanding of psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield. He knew that how battles were remembered would shape future ones. His actions were designed to leave an impression not just on the enemy he faced, but on those who would study the war later. By embedding unpredictability into his legacy, he ensured that future opponents would hesitate, unsure of how to respond to a commander who thrived on breaking expectations. In the end, Patton's greatest psychological weapon was his refusal to conform to the enemy's mental model. He did not fight the war the way his opponents expected it to be fought. He did not respect their assumptions or validate their fears. He imposed his own narrative through action, forcing the enemy to operate within a framework they did not choose. In doing so, he demonstrated that psychological warfare is not about intimidation alone, but about control. Control over perception, over tempo, and over belief, shaping the battlefield inside the mind as relentlessly as any physical advanced leadership under pressure reveals truths that comfort and routine conceal. In war, pressure strips away ceremony, theory, and illusion, leaving only decision and consequence. George S. Patton existed most fully in the stripped-down space. While many leaders sought stability before acting, Patton accepted instability as the natural condition of war. Pressure did not paralyze him, it clarified him. The greater the strain, the narrower his focus became, until only what mattered remained. Patton believed that leadership was not about being liked or admired, but about being obeyed when obedience was hardest. Under pressure, hesitation spreads quickly. A single uncertain order can ripple outward, infecting subordinates with doubt. Patton fought this relentlessly. He spoke with absolute certainty even when he privately wrestled with risk. This was not dishonesty, it was responsibility. He believed that a commander's doubts were a burden his soldiers should not have to carry. The winter of 1944 tested this philosophy brutally. American forces were exhausted from months of fighting. Supplies were stretched thin. Weather conditions were punishing. Communications were unreliable. Under such pressure, many commanders would have slowed down, tightened control, and waited for clarity. Patton did the opposite. He decentralized authority, trusted aggressive subordinates, and pushed decisions downward. Pressure, in his view, demanded speed, not caution. Patton understood that fear under pressure does not announce itself loudly. It appears quietly as delay, as excessive planning, as requests for confirmation. He treated these symptoms as threats, not because he lacked compassion, but because he believed fear left unchallenged became contagious. His harsh words and uncompromising standards were tools to cut through that fear, to shock men back into action before hesitation could harden into paralysis. Leadership under pressure also required visible presence. Patton made a point of being seen. He visited frontline units, spoke directly to soldiers, and placed himself in uncomfortable proximity to danger. This visibility mattered. Soldiers under extreme stress looked for cues from their leaders. Seeing Patton calm, confident, and demanding reassured them that someone was in control. Even his theatrics served this purpose. They transformed anxiety into spectacle, fear, into focus. Patton's pressure-tested leadership was not purely instinctive. It was informed by deep study. He believed that history was a record of leaders who either mastered pressure or were crushed by it. From ancient battles to modern wars, he saw the same pattern repeated. Those who waited for perfect conditions were overtaken by events. Those who acted decisively shaped events in their favor. Pressure did not create these leaders, it revealed them. He also understood that leadership under pressure required accepting blame. Success could be shared, but failure belonged at the top. Patton was willing to absorb criticism, political backlash, and personal risk if it meant preserving momentum. This willingness mattered to his subordinates. Knowing that their commander would stand behind them encouraged initiative. It reduced the fear of making mistakes, which under pressure can be more dangerous than mistakes themselves. Yet Patton's style came at a cost. His intolerance for weakness and delay could feel merciless. Officers who faltered under pressure were often relieved without ceremony. Patton believed that sympathy at the wrong moment endangered everyone. War, in his mind, was not a fair test of character. It was an unforgiving one. Leaders who could not function under pressure became liabilities, regardless of their intentions or past service. Pressure also exposed the moral tension at the heart of Patton's leadership. He demanded extreme endurance from his men, sometimes pushing them beyond what seemed humane. He justified this by arguing that decisive action shortened the war and reduced overall suffering. This logic was not universally accepted, but it guided his decisions. Under pressure, Patton prioritized outcomes over comfort, believing that leadership required choosing the least damaging option, not the most pleasant one. Patton's ability to function under pressure was reinforced by his personal discipline. He maintained routines, rituals, and mental frameworks that anchored him amid chaos. These habits gave him a sense of continuity when circumstances were volatile. They also projected stability outward. A leader who appears internally ordered inspires confidence in external disorder. Communication under pressure was another area where Patton excelled. He avoided complex language and ambiguous instructions. Orders were direct, aggressive, and time-bound. Under stress, simplicity becomes strength. Patton knew that clarity saved lives. Confusing orders forced subordinates to interpret intent, wasting time and increasing the chance of error. His bluntness, often criticized, was a deliberate adaptation to high-pressure environments. Patton also recognized that pressure magnified existing traits. Courage became bolder, cowardice became more visible, competence became decisive, incompetence became catastrophic. Rather than attempting to equalize these differences, Patton exploited them. He placed aggressive officers in key roles and sidelined those who required reassurance. Pressure was not something to be softened. It was something to be harnessed. For Patton, leadership under pressure was inseparable from moral example. He demanded sacrifice because he was willing to demand it of himself. He endured exhaustion, criticism, and personal isolation without complaint. This did not make him gentle, but it made him credible. Soldiers may not have loved him, but many trusted him because his standards applied equally upward and downward. The enemy, too, felt the effects of Patton's pressure-driven leadership. German commanders faced an opponent who did not slow down when circumstances worsened. This defied their expectations and strained their own leadership structures. Pressure compounded pressure. As Patton accelerated operations, German leaders were forced into constant crisis management. Their decisions became reactive, fragmented, and increasingly desperate. Patton believed that pressure was the natural state of war, not an anomaly to be avoided. Leaders who waited for relief from pressure misunderstood the nature of their task. He embraced pressure as a proving ground, a crucible in which real leadership was forged. In his view, calm conditions did not produce great commanders. Adversity did. Under pressure, Patton's leadership style revealed its core belief that war was a contest of wills as much as resources. Equipment could be replaced, positions could be regained, but once a leader's will collapsed, recovery was unlikely. By maintaining his own will under extreme strain, Patton imposed that strain on the enemy, turning pressure into an asymmetric advantage that shaped the course of operations and the behavior of everyone involved. Impossibility in war is rarely a fixed condition. It is more often a consensus, a shared belief formed by habit, doctrine, and fear. George S. Patton understood that what men label impossible usually means unfamiliar, dangerous, or untested. He believed that once impossibility was accepted as truth, it became self-enforcing. Roads went unused, plans went unmade, opportunities expired without being recognized. Turning impossibility into momentum was Patton's way of breaking that cycle before it could harden into defeat. In the winter of 1944, impossibility had many faces. Weather reports declared movement unrealistic. Logistics officers warned of fuel shortages. Staff planners calculated timelines that left no room for speed. Conventional wisdom said armies needed rest, regrouping, and perfect alignment of conditions before major action. Patton listened to all of this and treated it not as a barrier, but as a description of what the enemy expected him to believe. Momentum, in Patton's thinking, was not something that appeared naturally. It had to be created, often violently, by an act that defied expectation. The first step was mental. He rejected the language of impossibility because language shaped behavior. Once a commander said something could not be done, the discussion ended. Patton replaced that question with another. What would happen if it were done anyway? This reframing shifted focus from limitation to consequence, from fear to outcome. Turning impossibility into momentum required immediate action, even if that action was imperfect. Patton preferred flawed movement to flawless stillness. He believed that once forces began moving, solutions would emerge from contact with reality. Roads that seemed impassable on paper might be cleared by determination. Fuel shortages might be alleviated by captured supplies. Resistance might crumble faster than expected. Momentum created its own answers. Patton also understood that impossibility weighed heavily on soldiers' morale. When men are told something cannot be done, they prepare themselves for failure. When they are told it will be done regardless, they prepare themselves to endure. Momentum began in the minds of his troops. By issuing confident orders that assumed success, Patton normalized the extraordinary. What began as shock gradually became routine. Marching through snowstorms stopped feeling impossible and started feeling expected. The enemy experienced this transformation in reverse. What they believed to be secure became uncertain. What they believed to be safe became vulnerable. Impossibility had protected them psychologically. Once Patton shattered that belief, every position felt temporary. Defensive plans built on the assumption of Allied delay collapsed. Momentum fed on this collapse, accelerating as resistance weakened. Patton's approach relied on relentless pressure. Momentum cannot be paused without risk. He believed that stopping after achieving the impossible allowed doubt to return. Rest gave the enemy time to reinterpret events, to convince themselves that what had happened was an anomaly. Patton denied them that comfort. Each success was immediately followed by another demand, another push, another refusal to settle into safety. This approach placed enormous strain on men and machines. Vehicles broke down. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. Patton accepted these costs as the price of transformation. He believed that momentum, once established, reduced overall suffering by shortening battles and preventing drawn-out stalemates. Impossibility turned into motion, motion into advantage, advantage into collapse. There was also a personal dimension to this philosophy. Patton saw himself as a figure destined to challenge limits. He believed that history favored those who dared to move where others hesitated. This belief was not purely ego. It was reinforced by his study of past campaigns where boldness overturned superior numbers and entrenched positions. He internalized these lessons until they became instinctive. Turning impossibility into momentum required moral courage as much as physical courage. Patton had to accept the risk of failure publicly. If the impossible attempt failed, responsibility would be undeniable. He could not hide behind consensus or doctrine. This willingness to bear blame was central to his leadership. It allowed him to push beyond accepted limits without paralyzing fear of consequence. Momentum also changed how subordinates behaved. Officers learned that reporting obstacles was not enough. They were expected to overcome them. This expectation fostered creativity. Engineers improvised repairs. Supply officers found alternate routes. Infantry units adapted tactics on the move. Momentum forced innovation by making delay unacceptable. The psychological effect of sustained momentum was profound. Success began to feel normal. Fear shifted from advancing to stopping. Soldiers worried less about what lay ahead than about falling behind. This inversion of fear was one of Patton's greatest achievements. He transformed the unknown from a threat into a challenge. Impossibility lost its authority in such an environment. What had once required justification now required explanation, only if it was not attempted. The burden of proof shifted. Instead of asking whether something could be done, leaders asked how quickly it could be done. Momentum became self-reinforcing, carrying units forward even when individual confidence wavered. Patton understood that momentum was fragile. It depended on belief as much as movement. A single major pause could allow doubt to resurface. He guarded against this by maintaining pressure through communication, presence, and example. His speeches reinforced inevitability. His visits to the front demonstrated commitment. His intolerance for hesitation signaled that retreat into impossibility would not be accepted. For the enemy, momentum was devastating because it removed choice. Commanders could no longer shape events, they could only respond. Response consumed resources faster than initiative. Defensive actions drained morale. Retreats compounded fear. Momentum turned strategic problems into psychological ones, forcing the enemy to confront not just defeat, but inevitability. In turning impossibility into momentum, Patton did more than achieve tactical victories. He altered the emotional rhythm of the campaign. Time felt compressed. Decisions came faster. Consequences arrived sooner. The war seemed to accelerate, carrying everyone along with it, whether they were ready or not. Patton believed that wars were not won by waiting for possibility, but by redefining it through action. He treated impossibility as raw material, something to be reshaped through will and motion. Momentum, once created, became a force of its own, sweeping aside assumptions, resistance, and fear, leaving behind a transformed battlefield where what once seemed unthinkable had already become history. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.